Jessica is a research officer at ODI, working on issues pertaining to climate finance and climate change mitigation policies. Jessica works within the Climate Change, Environment and Forests program. So over to you, Jess.
Thanks. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for the previous presentations. I'm going to briefly talk about where are we now in terms of climate finance additionality, in terms of technical and political issues, and also what can be done in terms of potential solutions. Many of you may be familiar with what's come out of the Copenhagen Accord in terms of financial figures, but just to highlight a few bits that have come out. One is that the Copenhagen Accord does include a call for collective commitments by developed countries to provide both new and additional finance for climate change. It includes specific aggregate commitments to finance, one being in the short immediate term, $10 billion per annum between 2010 and 2012. And in addition to that, $100 billion annually beyond 2020. It also states that funding for these commitments will come from a wide range of sources, both public and private. What are some of the issues? Well, for one, it's unclear how additionality is being defined here. It does say new and additional, but what does this mean? As Nicola presented, there's several different concepts of what we can mean by additional. Is it additional to current commitments? Is it additional to current flows, or is it something else entirely? It is also unclear how the funding will be secured and where it will come from. It mentions a diverse source of funding mechanisms, but it's unclear as to what are actually being implicated there and whether or not it will come from existing ODA channels. It is unclear who will pay for what, which donors will be responsible for which portion of the funds. And there's no clear distinction between public and private finance. So it's unclear how much public climate finance will ultimately be provided, and therefore what size of the burden will be placed on governments. So the main takeaway message from this is that we're a bit unable to determine the extent to which additionality is being secured within the Copenhagen Accord and what kind of direction that implies for donor governments. So moving forward, what are the potential solutions to operationalize climate finance additionality? Well, one option would be securing additional finance at the source. And as Nicola mentioned, we reviewed 26 different proposals in our recent report that was commissioned by ONE. These proposals are around creating new and predictable resource mobilization mechanisms. There's many proposals on the table, and they can range from, we assess them in groups in terms of budgetary contributions, carbon markets, various forms of taxation, and a general other category, including bonds, currency transaction taxes, etc. While this is definitely a positive direction, and it was being discussed in Copenhagen, as I mentioned, there's no formal commitment on this that's been made in terms of which of these new and innovative sources are the most likely or politically feasible to move forward. There are certainly challenges in terms of how we mainstream these new sources of finance with current ODA channels. Another option would be securing additionality at delivery, or in terms of the operationalization of finance, so in terms of how the money is channeled on the ground. Well, it's more difficult to secure additionality at delivery given the substantial overlaps between climate change, in particular adaptation, and development. And as Guido said, operationally, adaptation finance must be synonymous with development finance. In fact, one of the main issues that I would like to raise is that securing financial additionality for climate change is more around how we actually define what we mean by additional and incremental costs, particularly as it relates to adaptation. So climate change does not just create new cost over and above development, but actually increases the actual cost of development itself. So defining incrementality of costs is quite difficult. So aside from these possible new and additional sources of finance that I mentioned in the previous slide, one can probably safely assume that current ODA will be going towards climate change. So if we do make this assumption, what are the possible solutions in terms of improving the tracking of ODA and the climate finance that comes under ODA? Well, there's discussions around this going on within both the World Bank and the OECD at the moment. Some of the solutions that are being proposed are in terms of tracking finance. So one option would be to track both ODA in terms of traditional ODA and then climate ODA. And again, the issue would be around determining the incrementality of climate action in development programs. It's quite challenging. Another possible solution would be creating a new climate finance target above the Gleneagles commitments. And another option would be strengthening current monitoring of climate finance, so enforcing the use of Rio markers for both mitigation and adaptation, making them compulsory and refining them to strengthen them, and also implementing similar measures within MDBs as well, and making the reporting consistent with current DAC reporting. However, there are some significant issues with these potential solutions. There's a recent meeting that happened with the high-level advisory group, which has been commissioned by the UN to be set up and to advise the UNFCCC process. And from this meeting, there's actually been some significant political pushback from donor countries like the US and the UK in terms of setting up common rules for measuring climate aid or climate finance related to ODA. One of the major problems here is that, as we previously discussed, a lot of the donors have differing definitions of what they refer to as additionality. So just to give an example, Sweden and Denmark, both with high levels of aid, propose that the 0.7% of GNI should serve as the baseline, and above which everything else is additional. Norway has arbitrarily almost used 2008 as a reference point, above which more funding would be additional. Finland is stating with it they currently have an aid level below the 0.7% and has already announced that climate aid will not be additional, at least in the near future in 2010 and 2011. And as Nicola mentioned, the UK has announced that they would like to limit the use of ODA for climate change to 10%. So in sum, I would like to reiterate that this is quite a contentious area, and there are clear solutions, as I've presented, in terms of ways forward for how additional finance can be secured, but there are significant both technical and political constraints to this area.